There we go. We are live. Yeah, but again, it'll be about a 10 or 15-second delay before our first people actually see us live. Folks watching the show here, welcome. It's Friday night. This is an unusual time to do the podcast. Don't usually do this on a Friday night. But tonight's an exception, and I am pleased to have with me a special guest, Christopher Bean. Hello, sir. Hello.
Hi. How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Which, by the way, I was actually planning on swapping out my hat for your hat, your Tactical Advantage hat, and I spaced it. I spaced it. Doggone it.
I think we'll make it through. That'll be all right.
Guys, so we're going to begin the podcast, the actual podcast itself here momentarily. If you're just joining us, this just is a consequence of recording my podcast live. You guys get to tag along on the video with us on YouTube or Facebook, wherever you choose to watch. And tonight we're going to be discussing cultivating community, which can have an impact on positive learning and student performance. It's going to be a great discussion, I think. A little bit different from, and probably a little bit more heady, from what we normally do on the podcast. But I think it's going to be a very valuable discussion. So I'm excited to have Chris with me, and we're going to have a good time. So we got a few of you jumping in now, and it seems like the technology is working, so that's always a good sign. So we're going to go ahead and begin the recorded portion of the podcast now. In 3, 2, 1. This is the Concealed Carry Podcast, Season 6, Episode 10. And welcome to the Concealed Carry Podcast, part of the concealedcarry.com network, brought to you by Mountain Man Medical. Today is Friday. Let's cancel that. Originally going to be yesterday that I was going to do this show. Friday, May 13th, 2022, as of the recording of this episode, and I am your host, Riley Bowman. This evening, this is actually a Friday evening we're recording this show. I have with me a special guest co-host, Christopher Bean of Tactical Advantage. Hello, sir.
Hello.
I'm thrilled to have you on. Been trying to get you on for a while. You're a busy man. And so I appreciate you for making time on a Friday evening to do this with me.
I certainly appreciate the opportunity.
We are here tonight to discuss a topic that I know you're very passionate about. I'm also passionate about, but it was actually your idea. And as soon as you mentioned it, I'm like, yep, that is spot on. That's what we got to talk about. We're going to talk about cultivating community, fostering engagement, impacting culture, all of that, I think, in a way of improving student learning and performance. This is going to come to you from a lot of the perspective of a firearms instructor or trainer. But I know a lot of things we're going to discuss this evening will apply to a lot of folks in a lot of avenues of life, work, business, education, whatever. But if you're a firearms instructor or trainer, I think this is definitely going to be one you're going to want to stick around for and listen to. Or if you're just a passionate individual about training and want some good tips of how to do it better, or some things that you might employ to make your learning environment more effective. But first, tonight our episode is sponsored by Mountain City Supply. Mountain City Supply is my choice for ammunition. And in full disclosure, they sponsor me personally as well, which I'm proud to be associated with a brand like theirs. I was going to mention that recently they got their brand new QC machine up and running. This thing takes photos from like a dozen different angles and uses like 9 different lasers or something crazy like that to measure every dimension of every round that passes down this special chute. As it does that, in an instant, it can tell which rounds are within spec and which ones are not, and it automatically kicks out the bad ones and keeps the good ones. Fortunately, with high quality reloading machinery and equipment, not too many have to be kicked out. But it's awesome to see how they take quality control seriously at Mountain City Supply. One of the reasons I'm proud to be associated with them, and they provide all the ammo that we use here at concealedcarry.com and with the Concealed Carry podcast. So, guys, check out Mountain City Supply for high quality, affordable, available ammunition. They've got ammunition available to purchase most of the time. It's rare you'll go on their site and see, 9mm, for instance, completely sold out. I know a lot of you guys out there looking for 9mm or maybe some other calibers. I'll tell you another one that's really hard to find right now. And it sometimes surprises people, but like 38 Special and 357 Magnum is hard to find. And when you do, it's kind of expensive. Mountain City Supply has it in stock right now. And it's a very, very reasonable price. So that's where I've been getting some 38 Special recently, as I've been experimenting with and trying some things on revolvers as of recently. So guys, check them out. MountainCitySupply.com is a place to go. I would have a discount code for the general public, but margins are pretty tight, as you might imagine these days. Our Guardian Nation members do get a discount off ammunition for Mountain City Supply. So that's something worth looking into if you'd like to save a little bit on your ammunition, as well as a bunch of other things, is a Guardian Nation membership, which you can find at guardiannation.com, just as a little side note there. But check out Mountain City Supply for your ammunition needs. They are working hard to bring quality ammunition to you and do it in a timely fashion. Also, today's episode sponsored by Ready Up Gear. ReadyUpGear.com is the place to find the equipment. Specifically this evening, I'm going to highlight the dummy ammo that Ready Up Gear manufactures. It is quality dummy ammo. They start with a actual once fired brass case that's cleaned and polished and all of that. It's then put into a mold where it's polymer injected with a specialized polymer in a bright orange color, at least the 9mm caliber. And we do have other calibers coming hopefully very soon. It's been in the works for some time, but currently 9mm and 223 available. And that polymer fills up the entire case, including the primer pocket. So some people are particular about not doing dry fire or things like that without something protecting the firing pin or striker a little bit more. I'm not necessarily personally all that concerned about that, but some people are. So the nice thing about Ready Up Gear dummy ammo is everybody can be happy. It's quality stuff. I like to stuff my magazines with it when I'm doing dry fire practice to get my mags a little bit closer to true weight. And it works really effectively in that fashion. Here's the best part too. Ready Up Gear dummy ammo is very affordably priced. There's some out there, some competing products where you get like 5 in a package and they cost $16, $18. Ready Up Gear dummy ammo is very, very, very affordable. So check it out today. Go to readyupgear.com and I hope you'll give it a try. Let's get into our topic. Again, I have with me Christopher Bean. Tactical Advantage is your training company. And you and I met, really officially got to start associating with each other and get to know each other through the Active Self-Protection Instructor Certification Program, part of the same cohort.
Yes.
And I'm so glad that we got to meet, because I consider you to be a dear, dear friend and someone that I always enjoy our time together, whether it's talking via text or over the phone or in person, such as recently when you helped me out as an assistant instructor in my Huntsville, Alabama class, which we'll reference here in a bit. But first, I want to give folks an opportunity to get to know who is Christopher Bean. Tell us a little bit about your background and kind of how I guess you came to be. Like, why are you even here, man?
What a question. Well, my name's Christopher Bean. I run a small company called Tactical Advantage, really focusing on smaller size individual type coaching. I've been a professional instructor for, right at 20 years, maybe 21, 22 now. Multi-certifications. I also am on the coaching staff at the Complete Combatant under Brian Hill and Shelley Hill. Now I'm actually part of the instructor cadre of the Active Self-Protection instructor certification program. So I've been doing this a while. Had some time to develop my ideas and how I kind of do what I do. I also work in corporate America, doing leadership development, business development, things like that. So I have kind of a unique perspective on how to apply some of those thoughts and theories into what I do in the firearms space. So it's been a pretty interesting journey learning some things over the years, but yeah, I mean it's a passion project for me. I'm incredibly interested in how people operate from a coaching perspective, as well as figuring out ways to help people learn more, perform better, and really apply what they're learning so it sticks, so they can use it after the learning exercise, right? So that's really what I've been focused on for the last 5 years or so, almost exclusively trying to figure out a better way to get people to perform and learn.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned 20 plus years of instruction. Was that, were you referring to in firearms instruction?
Yeah, in
Yeah. Yeah.
firearms,
I wanted to
in
make sure that
firearms
that was
directly.
clear. Which is fantastic. That's a long time, longer than me, about double what I've been doing professionally, I would say. Um, and as you mentioned, you work in corporate America. Uh, I'll tell you one thing that's kind of interesting about you, Chris, is that you are a bit of a sleeper. Okay, because if people, I think, just were to meet you at a function or a gathering or something, they would have no idea that you do what you do for your day job. They'd have no idea that you probably were even a firearms instructor, because they'd probably think that you were some hardcore like 80s rock, band groupie or something, wearing a Metallica shirt or something, and like uh you're just a sleeper, and you're also a sleeper as a shooter, and I want to make sure that that's clear, because you're also a really good shooter. And I know that you speak humbly of yourself in that regard, but I've seen it and other people have seen it, and you're a fantastic shooter. And so, as a firearms instructor, I want to make it clear that you check all the boxes. Number one, you got experience doing that. That's good. You've trained with a bunch of other instructors from a variety of different, you trained with a lot of people over the years, so you've got a broad base, and a broad knowledge base and experience base in that regard. You're a good shooter, so like we can tell that you know how to implement the things that you've learned, but not everybody's able to do that and then also pass that on to students. But where I think that you check some of those boxes is that you're also very analytical. I think that bodes well for an instructor, and you are very good at diagnosing things, which I think it ties in with the analytical piece, like being able to
Mhm.
look at problems and look at what someone is doing, and break that down, and begin, diagnosing what they need help with. Um, and you're a good communicator, very articulate. So, and I know it sounds like I'm probably just here to prop you up, which I am in part, because
Aw,
it's always good to get that little bit of a confidence boost. Everybody needs that sometimes, but also just to establish that, like, there's probably a lot of people listening to this podcast that haven't heard of you before today,
sure.
and so I'm establishing that credibility piece, that like what we've come here to talk about tonight, like, you understand as a topic, you understand as an instructor, as a trainer, and so there we go. We got that box checked. A few months ago, you were so kind to volunteer your time and assist instruct for me, which was a huge. Um, I was honored that you would do that for me. You would come and help with a class I was putting on in Huntsville, Alabama, that was sold out. In fact, oversold. It wouldn't have happened without your help. In that, I opened up a couple more seats because there was high demand for this class, and you helped me out. And it was wonderful to share the line with you that weekend and to see how you interacted with students on the line. And I think that by pretty much every account from everybody that was present, both on the student and on the instructor side, that it was a weekend of success. And there were some unique things that came away from that I did, at least some takeaways and things that I think tied pretty directly into our topic of discussion here tonight. And really, what we're, when we get down to the bottom, what we want to discuss is, are there things that we can do as a, and this is always interesting in the firearms space, because sometimes we say firearms industry or the training industry or the firearms community or the training community. There's all these like words we throw out there, and I don't know if all of them or any of them necessarily fit quite perfectly to describe what people mean a lot of times. I think community probably works pretty well, but how can we use community and maybe even culture
Great word.
to impact student learning and performance? And keeping in mind that the context here could be that we are all ultimately students. So that's what we're here to discuss. And that class in Alabama, man, like I've never seen anything quite like that, but it was unique from other training events I've been a part of. So I'll let you speak to that a little bit, because I want to get your perspective from your point of view, and let you kind of set the tone of where we go from here next.
Sure. And I think what happens a lot of times, especially from an instructor perspective, is we tend to forget that we're teaching people. And we really kind of want to focus on our curriculum or what we want to teach. And the individual or the person coming to us for guidance kind of gets lost in that mix. That's where I think it's very interesting to try. How do I want to word this, from an experimentation phase, to try differing ways to apply how we connect with people. Certainly, I think the class we're talking about, it was absolutely unique. I think it's going to be not necessarily time possible for all classes, but the yield we saw from that particular class was actually quite awesome. And I think it boils down to how we create culture. I think that was a great word, by the way, to use, but creating a culture where the class almost self-sustains the want to perform and achieve, versus the instructor driving that. I think that's the big difference. When the instructor drives it, you might see fleeting performance improvement, but normally it doesn't stick. When you create a community-based kind of culture, that support system, it's almost infectious. And then you'll start seeing a dramatic improvement in how people are reacting to potential failures, what they're learning from those potential failures, and then the successes kind of come. It's quite interesting. So I guess, if you want to talk a little bit about that class in particular, or how we kind of got there and what happened, that would probably get us started off pretty good, and we can just kind of roll with the punches from there.
Yeah. Let me throw out a couple of things I think contextually that apply here. What we did, I should say it wasn't so much what I did. I just was there to teach a class. A lot of this is attributed to you, in large part, and also the host of that class, and everybody involved. But there are other training opportunities where similar things perhaps happen and could happen. And by that I mean, like, there are some training schools, for instance, that you can travel to, where they have lodging on site, and maybe you eat meals and things with your fellow students or instructors even. I'm talking about like maybe like a gun site or a Thunder Ranch,
Mm-hmm.
or well, even Front Sight is kind of that way, right? or tactical response. And a couple of those that some people might not, place on the same level as some of the others I mentioned, but they all kind of have a similar approach in that they do generate a little bit more, I think, a sense of community sometimes, but they are traveling destinations for training, right? And that is the exception rather than the rule as far as how training is usually conducted for, I think, most people in most locations across the country. But just to point out, like that sort of thing can and probably does exist to some extent, maybe not equally, across all of those different places. And there are others for sure to be mentioned. Then also, I was thinking about how a lot of times when you take like national level traveling instructors and you have hosts that bring them in, usually how a lot of the seats in those classes are filled are from people that host knows, or
Sure.
the people from that local community. Maybe sometimes the host is an instructor themselves. Actually, a lot of times the host is probably an instructor, and they a lot of times have even taught a lot of the students that are now attending this class that the host is organizing on behalf of this national traveling, level instructor. And so I think that there are varying degrees. I guess where I'm going is there's varying degrees of effectiveness in how community and culture can be cultivated for training opportunities like this. And what I want to do now, having kind of established some of that context, is also kind of take it to the other extreme and use this Huntsville, Alabama class as an example of, really kind of seeing what you can really do if you want to, I guess. So this class started getting organized, put together by a mutual associate and friend of ours, Ethan.
Mhm.
And so he was the class host. He's connected to a bunch of guys, many of them local and some not necessarily local, but all mutually connected. Although I think we had a couple of people there that were more, they just happened to sign up. They, happened to be there because they heard of the class or whatever. Including some folks I had invited. And but what kind of next happened as this evolved was you jumped on board, and this is where you get a lot of credit. And I don't know whether you came up with the idea or someone else came up with the idea, but you ended up securing a massive house rented via Airbnb where like 80% of the class attendees stayed all together in this house for the weekend. Including instructors, me and you. I was there too. Now I know you gave me the option. You're like, well, I don't know if you want to do this, and I'm like, heck yeah! Like this is a unique opportunity to have almost everybody. Again, we were missing a couple of folks that ended up making lodging arrangements elsewhere, or they lived locally or whatever.
Mhm.
But I thought this was a unique opportunity to like truly be embedded with the people that I was there to teach for the weekend, and also to see kind of how the dynamic of this little community, this little band of misfits, shall we name
Yeah.
them?
The island
And
of broken toys.
and so that's kind of that's what I mean, like going to the like other extreme where this was essentially an open enrollment firearms training course, but where most of the attendees of that, including instructors, all lived together for basically 2.5 days and shared meals together and got up together and went to the range together and trained together. And like, that's, yeah, it was really interesting.
Yeah.
But I quite enjoyed it. Again, I don't know that every instructor would necessarily want to do that. But I enjoyed it. And it was cool seeing how this dynamic came together, and it really was this miniature community of individuals all there united with this purpose of training.
Yep. Getting better. I think what was interesting about that is it kind of pierced the veil between instructional staff and student. So it really got to the point where not only we all say, hey, your performance is our main priority here. It became really, really clear from the student perspective that we absolutely supported them, and that was really our motivation. So it was interesting, but on another note, it's also taxing. So I could understand that some instructors might struggle with that because you can never really turn it off. But if you have the right group of individuals, what you yield from it was actually quite interesting. And I think so. And we've talked about this a little bit on a sidebar, but I think you have support environments and competitive environments, and really that kind of bridges in any class. It's like a 2-day class. At some point, you start seeing where the group gets cohesive,
Mhm.
and it no longer becomes the 100% priority to perform at their own level, but they're more supportive of the people around them. And you can almost see an immediate shift in performance in the class as a whole when that happens. And I think what was interesting about that particular class is that started happening before we even got to the range. So it was actually really, really quick. And that's something I've been tracking over the years. Like, you can find subtle indicators in a student based on when they start creating their own culture. When someone's on a firing line doing an individual type test, where instead of everyone being quiet and worrying about when their turn is, they start being actively engaged in how other people's performance on a positive level is going for them, clapping when someone does well or supporting them when someone does, less than favorable. Those are interesting things to watch when it happens, and then start seeing what happens metrically once that does happen. And that class was, gosh, what, we were maybe 2-3 hours into the first day of class when that kind of triggered. And then, like, the growth was just massive. Not only was the growth massive, but people's ability to intake the information and actually own it kind of started happening really, really quick. And that's really the goal for us as instructors, is how quickly can we make that happen, and how willing are we to be innovative to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's causing me to do a lot of reflection, because it's like, well, how can that be duplicated
How can you
elsewhere?
bottle it?
Right. Yeah, how
Right.
can you bottle it? Yeah. Yeah, I wish you could, stick it in a bottle and just, sprinkle a little on top and, magically poof. But it obviously doesn't work that way. Um, and it's like, I've thought about it, and it's not feasible, at least for me, to especially where, like, in a few weeks, or I guess really in about a month, I'm heading to Michigan for
Mhm.
the same class, doing another class up there. Just got done doing one in Iowa a few 2 weeks ago. Yeah, just a little bit less than 2 weeks. And I love every class. Every class is awesome. Every class has its own highlights that come out of it, that I think back and think fondly and memorably about. Um, but I can't. Number one, you can't expect that, like, every host or every assistant instructor is going to be willing or able or even care enough to um, try to duplicate something like what we did in Alabama. Uh, and again, probably a lot of people wouldn't even go for something like that because, again, a lot of these classes are going to be filled by people that are more local to the area. So they may, well, why would I go stay in a house with a bunch of random people for 2-3 days when, that's just going to cost more. And, and plus, like, I'm just not comfortable doing that or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, so, it's not feasible to try to duplicate what we did in Alabama, um, for every class. So I guess I have to ask the question then, like, from your point of view, what are some of the takeaways that and commonalities and things that we can learn from something like that, taking this to the extreme side of the example of like really truly building a community of folks. Um, but what are some of the things that are more feasible or reasonable and more able to be implemented, do you think? But whether from a student's perspective, like what is there a role that the individual student can play in that? From the host perspective, and then also, of course, from the instructor perspective. What do you think there?
Yeah, I'll start with the instructor perspective because where I think we create our culture, right? We 100% have a hand in how that works.
Yeah.
And I think if you lead wanting to be student focused, you'll immediately start seeing yield there. The easy way to do that, if there's time constraints, is take an extra few minutes to kind of find out who people are, why are they there, like really what is their motivation, and that can simply be done as starting your classes with talking to people. Don't immediately kind of put on the armor of instructorship. Try and connect, and that usually kind of yields. And then try and foster an environment where they connect with each other, where it's not an individualized thing. I mean, you can make the analogy to sports. If you think about high performing sports teams, not individualized sports, that's really what happens with the halftime talks or the locker room talks. You're trying to drum up the group, and as the group, you might have a singular high performer in that group or a couple high performers in that group, but they bring everyone else with them because they are supportive of each other, and the overall yield becomes more than the sum of its parts. So I think that's really the biggest thing to try and do, is take more time to figure out how to find out where people are and meet them there and bring everyone along for the ride. And then, like, if we take it really deep, so anyone that's ever done a class that has a performance-based metric, um, the nerves and the things like that when it's their turn to perform. Uh, I mean, I've heard it 1,000 times, the heart in the throat, or the worrying if they're the last one on the line, or their turn, just dreading it. That's really indicative of them putting their self-worth into one particular performance, right? And everyone's afraid of being judged by their peers or being judged by instructors or whatever format they're in.
Mm-hmm.
But if you could set that up where the entire group understands that failure's a necessary part of learning, we're talking about learning environments here, and they support that's okay. I think you'll see quicker yield and quicker movement to high performance levels, versus everyone worried about their own singular performance, and individualizing kind of what they're experiencing. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
certainly not saying sit around and sing kumbaya,
Mm-hmm.
or get really into the weeds on what that looks like. But the moment we can have the entire group invested in the performance of the entire group, yield statistically becomes higher. And I've measured it again and again and again. But really, just connect. Spend more time trying to connect with people, more time having them understand that there's a you behind the curriculum, and it's not just a curriculum, because that stuff just doesn't stick. It just doesn't.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, okay. So I'm going to be honest and straightforward with you here, just based on what you've been talking about in the last few minutes. It's caused some thoughts to pop into my mind. The first thing was what are some simple things that an instructor can do to immediately start fostering community and culture? And like the very first thing I think is just helping everybody get to know one another, right? So I
Sure.
always like the classes that start, and I try to do this every class too, where you kind of start with hey everybody, obviously I'm Riley, I'm here to teach a class, but guess what? Like I want to hear from each of you. What's your name? Where'd you come from? Why are you here? And that's actually a question I think is really, really relevant. Is like why are you here? Like what are you hoping to achieve by being in this class this weekend? Like
Yep.
because that immediately informs me as an instructor of maybe some areas right off the bat that I want to be focused on for them, because that's why they're there. Um, so I can start tailoring what's taught to them as the student. And then also, like even just little information about like what's your background. Well, as soon as student A finds out from student G that, oh, I'm an engineer, well, I am too, or there's some kind of commonality there, like people can start gravitating towards one another a little bit, or feel a little bit more unified. And so that was where one of my thoughts went immediately, was like something as simple as that. And not every instructor, not every class does that, but I like doing that, even if it's relatively brief. um I think it's helpful. And I think it probably should be brief. I mean, like you don't want to like end up taking an
Sure.
hour to do introductions for everybody, right?
Sure.
So but
Well,
oh, do you want to add
yeah,
on to
I
that?
think, and I think you'll concur with this. I cannot think of a class that I've had over the course of the last couple years where there wasn't that one person that in some form or another says, well, I don't know that I belong here. I don't know that I'm good enough to be here, or something like that. Understanding that early is important. And understanding kind of where they are is important, because how can you teach somebody when you don't know their motivations for being there? Once you start understanding that, the coaching process becomes easier because you kind of understand what they need, and it immediately puts you in a position to try and provide what they need, not what you think they need. So it's a interesting skill to learn, learning how to deal and read people, versus learning how to explain your skill. Because at the end of the day, when we have paid clientele, it should 100% be about them, right? Not about you. Um, but yeah, that's really the thing. I go in, and you might have actually heard me say this. Anytime I teach or work with anybody in any facet of what I do, not just within the firearms instruction space, is I ask a couple simple questions. One, and the most important being, well, whom do I serve in this particular interaction? Is it me? Is it my ego? Or is it them? And then adjust accordingly. If you really sit and think about it, with almost any interaction, if you're really truly invested in them and what they're looking to achieve, they're going to get significantly more out of it.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. The other thought that came to mind was, as from the instructor perspective, was what could I do to try to cultivate a community and a culture before a class, which that's a lot more challenging a thing to do, because especially as a traveling instructor, because like I don't get to interact usually with these people ahead of time, face to face. At the very least, it's probably via email or some other means of written communication of, hey guys, class coming up, just checking in, and here's what you need, and blah 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 blah, right? uh, but like when I send those emails, just for privacy reasons, like everybody's blind copied, right? So there's not, you don't even have that opportunity to have people start conversing amongst themselves, that are attendees of the class. But the thought that came to my mind was, would it be worth the investment in time and effort? And would it be well received to have some kind of class group? Uh, I mean, immediately I think, well, a Facebook group would be an easy way of doing that, because they're easy to set up and easy to establish and easy to invite people. But obviously, there's going to be some students that don't do the Facebook thing, so that might leave them out. So it's like, well, all right, a forum of some kind, but immediately my mind has started thinking like, I wonder about creating some kind of online social group of some kind that everybody could join or at least be invited to. And again, not everybody's going to probably, even when they're invited, not want to do that, and that's fine. That's on them. But you get probably a good percentage of the class participating, and just start the conversation ahead of time. Like, it's probably a fairly common practice. I've kind of started doing it, but I haven't been very consistent with it. Of like, I have a group that I've invited alumni students to, and some of you, if you're students of mine, are hearing this. You're like, "Well, I didn't get that invite yet." Yeah, because I haven't been consistent doing it. But it's a fairly common practice with some instructors to sort of, "Hey, you get invited to my alumni group now." But that's post class.
Right. Where's the strength in? So, I mean, you have the commonality of experience when you have alumni pages, things like that, and they're great. But I'm kind of with you, doing it ahead of time in some form or fashion. I mean, from an instructor perspective, you could do it with simple questionnaires. Uh, a lot of times we send out questionnaires saying, "Hey, what kind of holster do you have?" Rarely do we talk about motivations.
Yeah,
So say if you understood, if someone was taking this class because a trauma or something that they're trying to protect themselves from, or they just want to perform at the highest level. What is the end goal? And then you can kind of tailor your thinking to that individual because of knowing that. But I tend to agree. I think, especially in your and my experience, I think online, if you can do it, if you can pull it off, I think is significantly underutilized. Uh,
mhm,
I think a big part of how our friendship started and blossomed was via that same kind of medium, as part of the active self-protection instructor certification, where there's WebExes that happen. So people start to get to know each other.
yeah,
And then once you're in person, you've already stripped away a whole bunch of the ego driven or egocentric kind of thinking. People already kind of know each other. So
yeah.
I think there's probably value there. It would take investment, but is the end game worth that investment? I think it could be for sure.
So I've got this Michigan class coming up, and it'll be my last class for a while this year, just by nature of how my schedule goes this year. But I think I'm going to try to experiment with some of what we're discussing right now, and even what you just said there a second ago, like a WebEx or a Zoom call ahead of time. I don't know that I've ever attended a class that did that either. At least making that opportunity available, being like, hey, like I could send an email to all the students. Hey, on Thursday evening, such and such time, here's a Zoom link. You don't have to, but would love to have you there. We're gonna do a quick Zoom call. Uh, Go over the requirements for the class, answer any questions you have, get to know each other a little bit. Like, that could be really, really cool to do.
Yeah. I mean, you could ease class flow and create a little bit of efficiency with it. So you could potentially cover some safety things, range rules, stuff like that, and save yourself a little bit of time from the administrative if you so chose. But it's a more comfortable environment to allow people to do that and let the conversation develop. Um, it's yeah, I just saw the culture comment. Very good, very good. But yeah, I mean, I that's something that I would be interested if you tried it to find out what your experience was with it, because I think that's a especially as technology develops, we know it's reliable and we could use that. Why not do that?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna do a little further thinking on this. We should probably move on to the next thing here, but I'm gonna do some more thought on this because I think this is really good stuff, man. This is really good stuff. I wanted to kind of again hear from you your thoughts on along a similar vein from the host and the student perspective, I think this is something too that if someone out there listening to the podcast hosts classes or is interested in hosting classes, they can have probably some measure of impact in this regard as well. And then also, again, kind of your thoughts on from the student's perspective, if there's anything you think worth discussing there, or at the very least, what can students, people planning on attending training, do ahead of time to sort of set themselves up, I guess, to be receptive to an effective culture in a training environment?
Yeah, I think so. From a host perspective, a host can make or break a class. Their willingness to input and make it a success is hugely important. So I think, and it's really, unfortunately, exceedingly rare that you have a really engaged host. That's where I will call out Ethan. He was just an amazing host. How he dealt with the particular class that we're talking about, it was just amazingly done. From a student perspective, I think it's important, and I also think it matters what kind of class you're taking. So if you're taking a class that is more about learning, or you're taking a class that's about proving your current level of skill, I think those are two very different things that need to be kind of hashed out and understanding your motivation and where that lies. But if you're going to learn, just really kind of shedding a little bit of the ego and the worry related to ego and performance. Because if you're going to learn, I think I mentioned it before, but failure is required. If you do not push to that failure point, you're not really learning. You're just either repeating what you already know and not trying to learn to implement anything new, or you're just not going to try. You're going to stay in that safe zone. And that's why you see a lot of stagnation in learning, or people that just go to classes and they don't really get anything out of it. They're the same shooter that they came in as.
Hmm.
So I think not being afraid to fail is huge. Not being afraid of judgment, because I mean, the simple way a lot of instructors say it is go, everyone's worried about what they're doing on the line. But is that really true? I sometimes maybe. But I
Yeah.
think if you let go of the judgment of everybody else and you really just start, exceeding what your own perceived limitations are, that's when growth happens.
Mhm.
And I think everyone that does a lot of training, or people that do instruction see a lot of shooters, you can see it when that happens. It's obvious. You can still have nerves. You can still be worried about performing well, but your self-worth does not come from a particular exercise on a particular Saturday on the range. Uh, when you can release that, wow, the things you can do. And that's why I think, really, if you think about it, why people have personal bests that rarely happen in communal type environments, because they're so worried about the judgment of others, they won't push past what they can currently do.
Yeah.
That's why you see a lot of personal records happening when someone's on the range by themselves, because there is no fear of judgment. And judgment's a construct. Even if someone that you've never met before is judging you, does that really impact your performance? Especially in a learning environment.
Yeah. Yeah. You're absolutely spot on there. I think that is actually one of the issues that keeps people from signing up from training in the first place. Sometimes is either fear of the unknown, because
Mhm.
there's this unknown, like you don't know for sure exactly what the class is going to be all about. You don't know for sure how it's going to go. You don't know for sure who's going to be there. You don't know for sure if you're going to even like the instructor or the curriculum in the first place. So there's all these unknowns. You don't know how you're going to stack up, how you're going to perform. So many unknowns. Fear of failure, another big, big, big one.
Mhm.
Not wanting to show up in a training class with a bunch of other shooters and be the low man or woman on the totem pole. and people don't like that. Or even like, and I've felt this myself,
Oh
where
yeah.
you kind of establish this a little bit of a reputation. People kind of know you when you show up, or even like I remember attending a class. I'm not going to mention for sure exactly which one it was, but I remember the instructor who had invited me to take that class from them made a point to point me out to the whole class, and I didn't mind. Although I'm sure there would be some people out there that would mind that. That's why I'm not mentioning which class, which instructor. I had no problem with that whatsoever. But by being singled out,
Oh yeah. It creates pressure, and
right, and
that
then everybody
happens.
else in the class is like, "Oh, who's this guy?" Like if
Yeah.
they hadn't heard about me before, so now there's this expectation that, well, this guy is supposed to be a shooter, like, and then there's that fear of failure because now an expectation has been set up,
Yep.
and that expectation has been placed upon you. Now you have to be the one that accepts that expectation. But the point is that you're absolutely spot on with some of the things I think that do hold students back in training. Um, and also even including signing up in the first place is a lot of just
Right.
various fears of some kind, and we got to push past that. And that's some I make a point to talk about that in the beginning of my class. Guys, like, let go of the ego. I don't know who you were, well, maybe I do, but like, as soon as you step foot through my doorway, my figurative doorway, if it's an outdoor range, as soon as you step foot through that doorway into my class, as far as I'm concerned, you are all equal individuals.
Yep.
Don't care who you are, what you've done, what your background is. I mean, I care. Okay, like, let's be clear. I don't not care,
Yeah, for
but
sure.
but I, everybody. My goal is that everybody is going to get the same treatment. I hope I'm going to endeavor for that. And what that means is not everybody gets exactly the same thing, but hopefully everybody gets exactly what they need, and that's going to be different and unique for every individual. And I want everybody to get this attitude of these expectations and these egotistical limitations, like, put that aside. You focus on you. Don't worry about the person next to you. Don't worry about what you think they think about you. Just do your thing. And you're exactly right. A remarkable thing happens when people let go of stuff like that. uh, we not only milk out of them their best performance, because a lot of times what holds us back is our own self-imposed limitations,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
but we also encourage the ability for people to let go sometimes and fail, and learning occurs when failure occurs, and that's a scary thing. Again, that's
Yep.
one of those things that holds people back, is they're afraid of failing. But you will not learn if you don't push the limits and
Right.
stretch yourself and occasionally fail.
Oh, preach, brother, preach. I mean, I can use a personal example of that, and we've talked about this in the past, but I just like anyone else, a certain number of people know who I am and know what I can do. I have also been called out in classes before, and it puts pressure on you. But I can think of one particular class that you and I took together, and it was profound for me because I did not perform well.
Mhm.
And in the beginning of that failure released me enough that I learned more in that class because I was no longer tied to an outcome. I was tied to learning. Uh, so I think I took away so much more than just if I'd have performed to my highest level and I got accolades for doing well or shooting well. Uh, you know, that can just happen on any given day, but actual learning, like, I was more focused on what was being said, the concepts that were being presented, things like that, than going, well, I need to run from point A to point B and basically put 6 shots on this target in whatever 3 seconds. It was more about, well, why am I doing this and what does this mean? So it freed me up to kind of worry about something else. And I think an interesting perspective that you brought up about fear of stacking up and things like that. If And this to help people that are really concerned about like their first class or something like that. The way I look at it like that, whether I'm in a class of 2 or a class of 20, if I am the worst performer in that class, I have 20 people to learn from, not just one. And I think if you frame it like that and you think about it like that, you now have a huge pool of experience and aptitude to kind of pull from versus, one person. Because at the end of the day, classes are communal. You can learn just as much from the person you're shooting next to as the person that's instructing the class. And I think that gets lost in the
Yeah.
mix a lot.
Yep. Yes. Uh, that's something I think that people need to, especially if you not are not a well experienced student. It's kind of, I guess that's the way to describe it. If you're not someone that has done a lot of training as a student, um, and been in a lot of different classes, you might not think about that. But that
Sure.
is a huge opportunity for learning, is not just the stuff that you do while you're on the shooting line, on the firing line, not just the stuff that you learn that you get from the instructor or feedback from the instructor, but when you're watching other people trying to do the same thing, like you should approach it from the perspective of viewing what they're doing through your own lens. Like, the stuff you're struggling with. A lot of times other people are going to struggle with the same things, and
Hmm.
sometimes they won't. Right? Sometimes they will do whatever the drill or exercise or thing is very well, and you can watch and try to understand, like, well, what are they doing differently than me that's leading
Absolutely
to that
right.
success? So viewing it kind of from you're a student there and you're observing other people in the class, try to view them from the viewpoint of the instructor a little bit, of like,
Hmm.
what is that person doing? Analyze what they're doing, diagnose what they're doing, and but view it with your own lens as it applies to you, so you can start you're creating your own feedback loop of sorts based on what you're seeing somebody else do. And that's one reason why I like doing relays in a class,
Yeah, I
even
was
when I
just going
don't
to say.
necessarily have to, because it creates that additional opportunity for learning. And I know that some people would be like, well, if I had the option of attending a class where I'm on the firing line the whole time, shooting and doing the thing, versus where I'm only on the line half the time, like, well, I want to be on the line all the time. You're missing, if that's your perspective, you're missing out on a huge opportunity for learning.
Sure. Yeah, and I was just going to say that as you kind of started leading that, there's like A/B lines or relays are hugely useful if you set it up correctly. Because then people are not only experiencing what they're experiencing when they're on the line, but they're seeing someone else experience it as well. And then they're privy to coaching that happens to other people. Either they can do it between themselves or between the instructor and the student, and they catch more.
Hmm.
Um, so, certainly you can go down a line of students and just say, hey, move your foot here, your shoulders bunching up there, and they're going to have, something quick to work on. But being exposed to more of that, as well as seeing it work with someone else, one, it buys credibility. Two, it improves the overall performance of the entire class. Um, and it's kind of fun because you start seeing things that you wouldn't see otherwise. I'm a huge proponent of that. Um, a lot of times it happens because classes are very full. But I think even if they're smaller, it should be implemented at some point, just learning how to watch. Because what I've noticed about people in particular, is their perception of what they're doing is somewhat skewed versus what we see.
Yep.
And when they see that from another perspective, it's like a constantly evolving demonstration,
Mm.
versus us just doing a demo and saying, hey, this is how you do this. They're seeing it from the learning perspective, and then they're seeing it from the developmental perspective, which is huge. I think it's got huge yield.
Yeah. And back to kind of the class culture piece, one thing I love seeing happen is as the class gets more comfortable with themselves and they start talking more amongst themselves. Now, this is a little bit tricky sometimes as an instructor to manage from a class management perspective.
Hmm.
Um, but I love seeing this back and forth discussion and feedback between, like if you have relays going, and so you got people maybe paired up or something, or even if it's not necessarily between relay pairs, but just when people start kind of talking amongst themselves, because well, a lot of times what's happening is they're discussing whatever's being taught from their perspective and what they're seeing and what they're realizing from it and putting it into their own words. And sometimes that discussion that takes place among students helps certain students grasp a concept that maybe they weren't quite grasping, because it's explained like already within one class. Like as an instructor, like I try to explain things where I can in a variety of ways so it clicks and resonates with different people, but I can't always do that, and I can't always do it for every person. But
Sure.
in that one little way of just having some student led discussion amongst themselves, those sorts of things happen, where things are explained and discussed in different perspectives, and that clicks and resonates with different people. um and sometimes, and I love seeing when like students themselves, like, yeah, they're not the instructor, and I know that maybe some people out there would be a little bit offended by this and kind of be like, well, who are you to critique me? But I appreciate and encourage when a student is like, "Hey, I'm your partner on the line here, and we've been shooting together now for a day and a half, and like, hey, you did this one little thing, like maybe make this one little tweak." And like that is a-okay as far as I'm concerned, and I think also results in dividends in the long run with the students. And the challenge again as an instructor is managing that so that the discussion doesn't get out of hand or distract them
Sure.
from the next piece that's coming, because obviously like I've got a lesson plan I'm trying to follow, um, that yes is adapted to the class and adapted to individuals, but I still gotta get certain things done.
Yeah. I mean, if you have people on paired up on the side of a line that are talking about how the grass grows, obviously that's not productive. But I think so. If we think about what we have from a time perspective as instructors, and let's just say we have 20 people, uh, there's limited time for us to explain conceptually what we want them to understand or want them to learn. And really, in my experience, when people learn and then move from learning to understanding is when they re-articulate these ideas. When they can form it into their own words, their own thoughts, and apply that to their own thinking. That happens when they're talking about it. So
Yep.
allowing that to happen, whether it's with us who have limited time because we have 20 people that we have to do this with, or amongst themselves, if it's proctored in such a way that that's really what's happening, you're getting a ton of value there. Just having them, I mean, we can only carry so many analogies in our bag, right, to kind of help reach people. But if they have, one, the permission to discuss it among themselves, as long as it's not distracting to the overall class flow, they are going to learn more. And I hesitate to use the word learn because I think they will understand more. And understanding is kind of the key. Not being able to parrot ideas or parrot kind of things that they were just explained, but really understand what that means and how to apply it. So
Mhm.
endlessly useful. You would certainly have to proctor it, but allowing it to happen uh, with some care, I think is important.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, this has been. I mean, I don't know if it's been as good for everybody else as it has been for me, but this has been like a really, really awesome discussion. That I feel almost selfish in a way, because I'm like, wow, I'm getting really good stuff here. Uh, like it's been like a counseling session, for me that's been aired publicly. But I think it's been really fantastic. Typically, we keep our episodes to an hour here, so we're actually just past an hour.
Whew, that flew by.
I know, right? But I don't want to turn off the fire hose, immediately. I want to just kind of throw it back to you, Chris, and say, like, what else do you want to throw out there relevant to this topic, if anything? Or if you're like, yeah, no, we've done this justice. If you want to offer some last words or a summary or whatever that might be too, like, um, feel free. But is there anything that we haven't covered that we really should discuss still at this point?
Well, I think just to reiterate something I spoke on in the beginning, and understanding that at the end of the day, we're dealing with people. And people have differing levels to consume information, to apply information. And if we apply that to ourselves, that's where I think you brought it up in the beginning. These are things that are kind of can be helpful in overall life, learning to shed a little bit of ego, open yourself up a little bit to learning, and dealing with people the way you would want to be dealt with. I mean, age old anecdote there, but when you start doing that, it's amazing what people can do when you do that truthfully and wholly. Um,
Mm.
so that's an interesting thing for me that I try and do in almost every interaction that I have, is just trying to figure out where someone is and what can I do to make that where they are and where they want to be easier and a better transition. And I think if you actively think about that, really, really great things can happen. They really can.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Nice comment here from Scott on Facebook. If the instructor encourages partner collaboration, it will happen. I've seen it happen a couple of times, and you're right. It's awesome. Always nice to be validated, Scott.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Scott.
yeah, I've seen that. I've experienced that myself a number of times in classes, and yeah, sometimes I've come away from classes with big takeaways that wasn't something the instructor said, but was something that I either observed in somebody else, or was from a conversation I had with somebody. And I'll also say too, for those of you that are a little bit more experienced, I think that there's a little bit more of a responsibility placed upon us, to be leaders in our communities. And I was once paired with somebody in a class that was very uh, much separated from me in terms of skill level, and I think that was maybe not entirely intentional, but like, it was just one of those things that it was a class where we did relays, relay one, relay two, or A, B, or whatever. And I just got, stuck with this person. And I don't, that wasn't a bad thing. But when it happened and I got to know them and got to see them shoot, I was like, this is good because I can do some things to help them.
Yep.
And I know the instructor observed that and was like, oh, I'm so glad that you are paired with them, because frankly, they were kind of I think the class was a little bit above them in their, like they weren't quite ready for it. And it would have required a little more care and attention from the main instructor. If I couldn't have been right there with that person all weekend long and like really keeping an eye on them and just being able to help them along, they would have struggled if they didn't have that. So I think that's something that's good for those of us that are a little bit more experienced to recognize that, hey, you are a leader in this industry, in this community, or whatever. Act like it and step up to the plate and help people out. Like ultimately, I mean, that's my perspective. I'm a big believer in helping others. That was the way I was raised. I was raised by a mother and a grandmother and a family with Christian values of like help your neighbor, be a good brother or a good sister or whatever, to in the bigger picture of things. And it's good to be able to have those opportunities. So and I appreciate when I see that in others, and I
I,
appreciate
yeah.
it too. I'll tell you another thing. I shared the line once. Now I wasn't paired with him, but I was right next to him. Shared the line with BJ Norris
Mm-hmm.
in a class, and I mean BJ is a world champion shooter, especially in Steel Challenge, and just a phenomenal shooter, right? And it was really awesome to spend a weekend with him where I felt like I was the low man, you know. I mean, there were certainly shooters that were lesser skilled than I in that class, but like just being next to someone like him and being able to have conversations and you know, share ideas and feedback and whatnot, and also seeing someone of his caliber make mistakes even
Yeah, because
is
we
refreshing.
all do.
Hmm.
That gets lost. But I think that's a great point. Is when you're in that environment, uh, the entire environment is an opportunity to learn something. The entire environment is. I think the other end of the spectrum that certainly don't want to talk about, because it's not necessarily positive, but you will inevitably run into people that want to negatively impact others or really really kind of show their skill
Hmm.
at your sake. And I would tend to tell them, in my experience, uh, normally the people of true high level skill have surpassed that. There's no need to do that anymore. Uh,
Yeah.
and it's better when you can kind of relinquish a little bit of that, because you will perform better, especially if you have developed skill in those situations where
Yeah.
you're no longer so wrapped up in what you can do or how you are negatively impacting others. Because I think it's almost a form of sabotage, really. I've almost seen it in classes where if somebody's doing individualized testing where they talk while someone else is testing or things like that. It might not be purely conscious, but I think there's
Mhm.
a subconscious aspect to it going,
Mhm.
whew, I sure hope that person doesn't do
Yeah.
well. And
Yeah. Yeah.
man, help them do well, because what does it cost you? Nothing. It doesn't change what you can do. Try and help others get to where you are.
Mhm. Mm. Yeah, you're right, and I've seen that as well, where someone has clearly showed up to a class. What I mean, I'd like to think that they're there with a purpose too, beyond like I mean, hopefully they're there to learn something too, but maybe not everybody is. But I'd like to think that that still is there to some extent. But they're there also, like you said, to sort of
Prove.
yeah prove who they are, you know, and their skill level, and that's a sign of somebody that's insecure actually
Sure.
in who they are, and that's why so often we see. I mean, just the fact I was in a class with BJ Norris, like the fact he was in a class, like that speaks volumes. Um, he doesn't need a class like that, probably, I suppose, uh, compared to us mortal folks. But it shows humility that he'd be willing to attend a class, and there was no ego on his part. He just did the thing, and he did it remarkably well. Um, but clearly he's secure in who he is, as far as I could observe, because he's been there, done that. He truly is a world class shooter. But you do
Sure.
see those individuals that I think it's a sign of insecurity when they feel like they have something to prove. Um, and that's unfortunate. But I hope that folks, by listening to this conversation here this evening, can give that some thought and like watch for that yourself within yourself, and at the very least understand that like it's okay to go to a class and make mistakes, because as I talked about earlier, like that's a big part about learning. It is completely okay. um the other thing too is like sometimes you have classes, and mine is one of those where there's maybe an award that someone can be awarded by performing at a certain level, and you might get people that show up, and that's a big desire of theirs is to have a shot at winning such award.
Sure.
And like that, I don't have any problem with that. Like I I have desires to win some of those kinds of things, you know.
Absolutely. We would be lying if we said, anyone that performs at a relatively high level, that it doesn't give you pleasure to perform at that level, right? But
Yep. Yep.
that's a return on investment from work.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean someone's worth any more or any less if they're not performing at that level. I think that's the rub, where people get twisted up and thinking, well, if I can't do that, obviously, I'm not good enough. No, that's not the case. You're just not there yet. I think that's what people kind of tend to forget too, is um, none of us were born good at this
Mhm.
in any endeavor, right? We're maybe
Mhm.
good at breathing, but everything else is a learned skill, and it requires development. And you cannot get there without making that first step. So if nothing else, I think it's really important that we do our absolute best to welcome people into what that development phase looks like, so they continue with it.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Again, and we kind of started at this place earlier on in the discussion tonight, uh, and this has been true with me. I've gotten my best performances. I've had my best opportunities at winning certain things, awards, prizes, whatever, when I wasn't so focused on trying to produce an outcome, but just simply let it happen.
Yep.
And that's a hard thing. And so, for those of you, again, if you're out there, and some of you are, where you show up at a class and you're really focused and as far as wanting to be able to do a certain thing, you've got to watch for that desire and try not to let it sabotage yourself, especially, and simply just let stuff happen. Okay. If you focus on the process, the results will come.
Hmm.
And it is as simple as that. Although it's simple as that, and it's simple and easy to say, but it is hard to do.
Absolutely true. Uh, I think that's a good example, though. Uh, Subconscious competence, obviously getting into stuff like that, where I try and use an analogy. It's probably not the safest analogy to use, but people can experience flow state, which is kind of basically what we're talking about,
Mhm.
all the time and don't realize it. Like one of those would be like you drive the same route to work every day, and you have one of those days where you can drive home. You don't necessarily remember the drive, but you drove it perfectly. You're allowing the subconscious to do the work while you're somehow occupied with something else. But do the same thing and say, I need to turn left in zero point 0.2 miles. Well, you're worried about turning left. You're not worried about driving the car, which you're absolutely capable of doing from a subconscious level. I think that applies really well to shooting, because I think the mechanical phase of learning how to do it is relatively small. We as a collective make it significantly more complex than it really is. I think that's the unexplored dynamic, is mentally, how do you release yourself to do something you already know how to do? Um, that is the hard part. But when you learn how to do that, you might only see it initially 1% of the time, 5% of the time, 10% of the time. But once you start developing that, the worry of performance kind of goes away, and it's displaced by real performance.
Yep.
That's a good place to be.
Yeah. Yep. And that could be a topic all of its own for
Oh
another
yeah.
time.
Round two.
Well, Chris, start wrapping it up here. I really appreciate you doing this episode with me tonight. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. A lot of ideas have come out of this, and things that I'm going to have to try to explore some more myself and maybe try to implement. Um, I, like you and like many others, want to get better at those things we do, better at shooting and better at teaching, as that is a part of my life now. Well, at this point, final words, sir, your parting words. It could be anything, advice, or you could just say, that's all I got. Goodbye. But this is your time. Go ahead.
Really, we all only get one shot at this. Enjoy it. Enjoy it.
Good. It's good. Good advice. Folks, thank you for being along with us for the ride tonight in this episode. Again, it's sponsored by Mountain City Supply, mountaincitysupply.com, and also ReadyUpGear.com and Ready Up Gear's dummy ammo. We have a number of sponsors of the podcast, and they make it possible to produce this podcast. And I'd like to think we do a good job and give people good quality content. Please support our sponsors that support us and make what we do here possible. And I hope that you'll take home with you. Of course, you may already be in your homes, or maybe in your cars or your trucks or your, bulldozers or whatever, and are able to implement some of the ideas we discussed here tonight and be a better student, be a better host, be a better instructor, or just a better person in general. I think if you think deeply enough about some of the things we've talked about tonight, that you can find ways to implement some of the stuff we've discussed in a variety of contexts, in your homes, at work, at church, with your children, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been enlightened and what's the word? I don't know. Improved is the word that comes to mind, but that sounds a little bit weird. I feel enlightened because of this conversation tonight. So thank you, Chris. Appreciate your time tonight.
I appreciate the opportunity, Riley.
So with that, folks, we're going to let you go. We'll be back next week with more episodes of the Concealed Carry podcast, and may have to try to have Chris back on again as a guest co-host because I enjoy our conversations. Although, again, he's a busy guy, so we'll have to give him some time off or whatever, so he can do all the other things that he's got to do. But until next time. Oh, I should have said this earlier. Where can folks find you?
Well, currently I'm doing instructing under the Complete Combatant with Brian and Shelley Hill. My Tactical Advantage website is currently under construction because I'm changing some things about how we're branding and what we're doing. So really, if someone's interested in finding and training with me, thecompletecombatant.com would be the way to do that. If from an instructor development standpoint, obviously active self-protection instructor certification, I can be found there, actively trying to develop new instructors to understand a more value-added way of doing things. But really, I'm kind of sneaky. I fly under the radar, so you got to hunt for me if you're looking for me.
Well, we are going to be back together again next year for a class with Tim Herron that I think is going to be similar in its approach. So I'm looking forward to that and looking forward to continue to build that community of training individuals. And I'm excited to also just be along for the ride as I play the assistant instructor role to Tim. So it'll be a good time.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
Well, until next time, folks, a reminder to train right, train often, and train safe so you can fight hard, fight fast, and fight true. Take care. Have a great evening.